Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into a pretty heated conversation about where the Democratic Party stands today.
Yep.
You Talk, We Listen is sponsored by OtisWho Network out of St. Louis.
Okay.
It's especially interesting because the critique is coming from, get this, Bill Maher, a big liberal figure.
Yeah, and he's not just making some, general comments. He's got a pretty specific argument here.
Oh, yeah.
He's saying that the Democrats, specifically those on the progressive side, are pushing this, woke agenda. And he thinks it's really out of touch with what average Americans care about. And he particularly points to Black and Hispanic communities feeling this way.
When I first heard that, I was like, wait, is Bill Maher really saying this?
Yeah.
I mean, he even goes as far as comparing the Democrats to, a Portlandia sketch.
Right.
That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, and I think that analogy really gets to the core of what he's saying. Portlandia kind of makes fun of, hipster culture.
Yeah.
So he's implying that Democrats are seen as this, out-of-touch group, worried about things that most working-class people just don't relate to.
He also goes on to say that the Democrats lost to, and I'm quoting here, an actual crazy person.
Oh, wow.
Do you think that kind of talk helps anything, or is it just adding fuel to the fire?
It's definitely provocative, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about how we judge whether a candidate is mentally fit, and how much that perception actually sways voters.
Shifting gears a bit, Maher makes an interesting point about Black Americans. He says they're not looking for pity or white guilt.
Right.
They just want real solutions to the problems they face every day, like being able to afford to live, job security, and feeling safe in their communities.
And he backs this up with a poll that shows more Black and Hispanic Americans actually believe America is the greatest country in the world compared to white progressives.
It's almost the opposite of what you usually hear.
Yeah, definitely makes you think.
Okay, so then he brings up immigration. Maher says that white progressives are more in favor of illegal immigration than Hispanic Americans are. Yeah, that's interesting.
It seems like there could be a disconnect between what a political group claims to stand for and the reality for the people they're supposed to represent.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if the people who are dealing with immigration firsthand have a different perspective than those who are pushing for open borders, more from an ideological standpoint.
That's a great question. Then from immigration, the conversation jumps right into the debate about the Electoral College.
Ah, the Electoral College.
The argument here is that it's actually a good thing because it stops big cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York from having all the say in elections.
You don't hear that argument very often.
Right.
Most of the time, it's all about how the Electoral College is outdated and needs to be changed.
Yeah, for sure. So this conversation is kind of making us look at things from different angles, even if it goes against what we usually think.
For sure.
Then comes what I thought was the most provocative part of the whole thing.
Okay.
Someone says, and this is a direct quote, "A majority of illegal immigrants are women voters."
It's like they're implying that women voters are somehow responsible for illegal immigration.
Yeah, it's important to remember that this is just one person's opinion during the conversation, not necessarily what Maher or anyone else believes.
Right. We're just telling you what was said. And then it gets even more heated when they talk about the people who voted for the Democrat in the election they're talking about.
Okay.
They call them low information and even brain dead, which I have to admit made me cringe a bit.
Yeah, that's definitely harsh language, and we're not saying we agree with it. It just shows how charged the conversation was.
Yeah, and it's pretty dangerous to just dismiss whole groups of voters as uninformed or not smart enough.
Absolutely.
So this leads into another big part of Maher's argument. He says that a lot of voters are what he calls low information voters, meaning they don't really follow political issues closely.
And that idea of low information voters goes back to his point about the Democratic Party. It's like he's suggesting Democrats are failing to reach these voters because they're too focused on things that don't relate to everyday concerns or that just go over people's heads.
So it's like they're speaking a language that a lot of people just don't get or maybe don't even care about.
I think it's more nuanced than that. It's not just about the language. It's about what they choose to focus on.
So what is he saying Democrats should be focusing on instead?
Well, based on the conversation, it sounds like he thinks they're spending too much time on things like identity politics and social justice,
Right.
while ignoring more basic things like the economy, healthcare, and education.
So he's basically saying they need to stop talking about woke stuff and start talking about what's hitting people in their wallets.
I don't think it's about stopping, but maybe more about broadening their focus.
Right.
It's not that social justice issues aren't important, but he's saying that for a lot of voters, economic anxiety is a much bigger motivator.
And that's where it gets really tricky. How do you balance those competing priorities? How do you address the real struggles people are facing financially while also fighting for social justice and equality?
That's the million-dollar question right there.
Yeah,
And it's what makes this conversation so interesting. It forces us to confront how complicated our political landscape really is.
that's Ollie.
And how tough it is to appeal to a diverse group of voters who all have different needs and concerns.
We've only just scratched the surface here. We
Yeah.
haven't even gotten to the really controversial stuff.
Yeah.
Before we move on to that, what really jumped out at you from this part of the conversation?
Honestly, what struck me most was how direct Maher is with his criticism.
Yeah.
He's not holding back at all. He's directly challenging the Democratic Party to rethink what they're doing and whether their current strategy is actually working for most Americans.
That's a great point. And it leads us into the next part of the conversation where they really dive into some sensitive topics,
Yeah.
including some of the opposing candidates' behavior and how some people try to defend those actions.
Interesting.
We'll get into all that in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
Okay. So yeah, get it into this next part is going to be a little
Uncomfortable.
yeah, uncomfortable for sure, but to really understand what's going on in this conversation, we have to talk about it.
Oh,
They start discussing the other candidate, the one they were running against,
right?
and they bring up some of his most controversial moments.
You mean things like that, grab him by the comment? I mean, that caused a huge backlash when he said it.
Exactly. And they even talk about, those accusations that he incited the Capitol riot.
It's hard to believe anyone would try to defend that. But in this conversation, they actually do.
Yeah.
How do they even try to justify things like that?
Well, they try to explain it away by saying, it's just like stuff people might say in private.
Yeah.
Like it's just locker room talk, or that everybody says things they wouldn't want repeated publicly.
So they're basically saying we shouldn't hold him to the same standard as everyone else because he's not a typical politician.
Yeah, I think that's what they're getting at.
Hmm.
They seem to be saying that his behavior, while maybe not the best, isn't really that different from what happens behind closed doors in a lot of places.
That makes me wonder, though, do we expect more from our leaders than we do from ourselves? Should we hold them to a higher standard?
That's a really good question, and it's something people have been debating for a long time.
Yeah.
On one hand, you want your leaders to be role models, to embody the values we want to see in society. But they're also just human beings. They have flaws like everyone else.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to find it, and this conversation really shows that struggle between those two perspectives.
Yeah.
It also makes you think about how much we should care about what someone does in their personal life when we're deciding if they're fit for public office.
Exactly. And that's something for you, the listener, to think about. What are your own standards for people in power? Do you think what someone does privately should keep them from being in office? Or are there some things you're willing to overlook if you think they can do the job?
These are questions we all have to wrestle with as we try to figure out the whole political landscape.
Definitely.
And they're not easy to answer. What I also find fascinating is how this conversation brings up the bigger issue of how we consume information and whether we're thinking critically about it.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Remember how we were talking about low information voters earlier?
Right.
Well, here, they take that idea even further.
Okay.
They're saying that a lot of people just kind of passively take in information without really questioning if it's true or considering other points of view.
So it's not just that they're not looking for information, it's that they're not really thinking about the information they do get.
Right, they're just accepting things at face value without any real analysis or considering where the information is even coming from.
Exactly. And this reminds me of all the misinformation and disinformation that's out there, especially online and on social media. It's so easy to end up in these echo chambers where you only see things that agree with what you already believe.
And that's a problem because it makes it harder to have real conversations and make informed decisions.
Yeah, it's like we're all living in our own little worlds with different sets of facts.
Right.
And that makes it almost impossible to bridge the political divide.
It does. And this lack of critical thinking plays right into Maher's critique of the Democratic Party. Remember, he's saying they're failing to connect with average Americans?
Right, because they're so focused on these issues that either don't affect people struggling with everyday problems or they're just too complicated for people who aren't political junkies.
He actually compares the Democratic Party to the Titanic.
Whoa, okay.
You know, like sinking fast and holding on to old ideas.
Wow.
He even pictures himself like Leonardo DiCaprio's character Jack, clinging to a piece of driftwood, trying to survive.
That's a pretty powerful image.
Yeah.
It really shows how urgently he feels about this. Like he's really worried that the Democrats are heading for disaster if they don't change their approach.
But not everyone in the conversation agrees with him, right?
You're right, there are others who push back and say he's actually closer to the progressive Democrats than he thinks.
So they're saying he's criticizing the very people he should be siding with.
Yeah, it's interesting. Right.
Yeah, it shows how fluid those political labels can be
Mm.
and how people can have opinions that seem to contradict each other. It also shows how hard it is to put people neatly into categories like left or right.
It's much more complicated than that.
There's a lot of gray area there.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big takeaway from this whole conversation.
Yeah.
We shouldn't oversimplify things or put people in boxes based on their political beliefs. It's just not that simple.
Right. I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest problem with this whole low information thing? Is it just that people are making bad choices when they vote because they don't know enough? Or is there something even deeper going on?
I think it's both.
Yeah.
It definitely affects elections when voters don't know the issues or the candidates well enough.
Yeah.
But it also does something else, something that I think is even more concerning.
Like what?
It erodes people's trust in institutions, it makes the polarization worse, and it makes it harder to tackle the really complex problems we're facing as a society.
Yeah, it creates this environment where misinformation can spread like wildfire and it's easier to manipulate people.
Exactly.
And that's really dangerous for any democracy.
We've covered a lot here in this segment. We've talked about controversial things that were said and done, the dangers of not having enough information, and the importance of thinking critically.
Definitely a lot to unpack.
What stands out to you as the most important insight from this part of the conversation?
You know, I think the biggest takeaway for me is realizing how much more divided our political conversations are becoming.
Yeah.
And how much of that division comes from people not really engaging with information in a critical way.
It's a good reminder that we all have a responsibility to be informed, to think for ourselves, and to talk to each other respectfully, even when we disagree.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that leads us to the last part of our deep dive,
Okay.
where we'll explore some possible solutions and leave you with some things to ponder. So we've talked about some pretty heavy stuff in this deep dive, you know, Maher's critique of the Democrats, all the political stuff, and how we deal with all this information overload. But where do we go from here? Like, what can we actually do about these problems?
That's a good question. And I was thinking about that when we were discussing those low information voters,
Yeah.
calling them that almost feels like part of the problem, you know?
Yeah, it does sound kind of dismissive, like we're looking down on them.
Exactly. And it
Yeah.
creates this us versus them mentality, which just makes the divide even worse.
Totally. So maybe instead of focusing on the label, we should try to understand why people are so disengaged.
I like that.
You know, like what's stopping them from participating in politics? And how can we remove those obstacles?
Yeah, that's a much more positive way to look at it. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about understanding why this is happening.
Exactly. It makes us consider things like access to information, education levels, economic inequality, and even like the way our political system is set up.
So we're not saying these people are uninformed. We're saying these people are facing real barriers
Yeah.
that make it hard for them to get involved.
Right. And then we can start asking, what can we do to help? How can we make politics more accessible, more inclusive, and more responsive to everyone's needs?
I love that that way of thinking is so much more empowering for everyone. It's about working together instead of judging each other.
Definitely. And that takes us back to Mark's point about Democrats needing to reconnect with average Americans. How would they actually do that? What specific steps could they take to rebuild that trust with voters who feel like they're not being heard?
Well, based on what we've talked about, it seems like economic concerns are a big deal for a lot of people. So maybe focusing on policies that address those issues would be a good place to start, like creating jobs, making housing more affordable, improving access to health care, things like that.
Those are all important, but it's not just about policies. It's about how you talk about them.
Okay.
It's about communicating in a way that people can connect with, that shows you understand their struggles and offers real solutions.
It's about showing that you care, not just saying that you do.
Exactly. And it's about building relationships, not just trying to get their vote. It's about having real conversations, listening to their concerns, and working together to find answers.
That sounds like a huge challenge.
It is.
But if Democrats are serious about winning back voters and fixing the problems our country is facing, it's a challenge they have to take on.
Absolutely. And it requires a major change in how they see things.
Mm-hmm.
It's about moving past partisan politics and realizing that we all need to work together.
It's about focusing on what we have in common, not what sets us apart.
And it's about recognizing that each of us has a part to play in shaping the future of our democracy.
So there you have it, folks. A deep dive into a very thought-provoking conversation about the Democratic Party and the challenges we're facing in our political system. We've covered a lot of ground, criticism, statistics, controversial statements, even some uncomfortable truths. You Talk, We Listen is sponsored by OtisWho Network out of St. Louis.
And we've really tried to unpack these issues in a way that encourages you to think for yourself, to have respectful conversations, and to understand just how complex these things really are.
We didn't shy away from the tough questions,
Mm-hmm.
and we didn't pretend to have all the answers. Our goal was to give you the tools and insights you need to navigate these issues and to start having those important discussions about the future of our democracy.
We hope you'll keep exploring these ideas, keep challenging your own assumptions, seek out different perspectives, and most importantly, don't be afraid to have those tough but respectful conversations, even when they're hard.
Because that's how we learn, that's how we grow, and that's how we create a more informed and engaged society.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.